There has been amazing growth and abundance in most parts of the Red Gardens project this year. The weather so far this year has been okay, but not great, and I've heard a bunch of the local farmers complaining about a relatively poor growing season, especially lately. But my gardens are doing better than ever, and I've been trying to figure out why that is the case. I think there are several factors involved, including significant changes that I've made, trying some new things, and better management and focus on my part, all combining to produce a very good growing year in the vegetable gardens so far. Most of the crops in the gardens are growing well and are mostly healthy and disease and pest free. The gardens look great and very lush, though there is still some differences between them, as not everything is growing as well as it could be. I've already harvested a lot from the earlier crops, and there is currently an abundance coming out of the outside gardens and the polytunnels. Some crops are excellent, with abundant and fast growth, and I expect really good yields from the crops that I haven't started harvesting from. And some crops are growing too well, with the plants growing too big for the space that I've given them. Some of the main crop potato plants are too big, crowding out the other crops beside them, and I've been pulling these plants in, trying to contain them in a smaller space, causing some damage to the leaves and stems. The pea plants in two of the gardens have had really fast growth, probably too much for the space that I've given them. I had planted these batches fairly intensively with a double row of lots of closely spaced seeds, and there seemed to be full germination of the seeds, which I didn't bother thinning. So I started out with more plants than I'd planned for, and I'm also growing a different variety, which is possibly a more vigorous plant than the one that I'm used to. Whatever the reason, I don't think I've ever seen this kind of abundance from pea plants, with the plants growing too big for the space and too tall for the supports that I've given them, with a lot of parts of the plants falling over. They are cropping really well, and I expect a huge harvest from a small space, which is what I wanted, but it's also really hard to find all the pods. Good weather is usually the easiest explanation for abundant growth in the gardens, but most people around here don't think we've had enough good weather yet this year. Late winter and early spring were a bit warmer than usual, with a mean overall temperature for both February and May being about 2 degrees Celsius above what we would normally expect, and March and April were about a degree warmer. This doesn't sound like much, but in a cool climate like we have in Ireland, every little bit of extra warmth in the spring can help, especially when our growing season can start quite early in the year. I did notice that this increase in the mean or average overall temperature seemed to be more the result of an increase in overnight temperatures rather than warmer days. This is reflected in the monthly data for solar radiation from the National Weather Service, where both May and July had significantly less sunlight than in the previous 3 years, and the other months seemed typical or perhaps on the low side. So for good chunks of the growing season, it was a bit warmer overnight, probably because it was generally cloudier. These warmer overnight conditions are good for plant growth, assuming that the plants can get enough actual sunlight during the day to photosynthesize. Good for plant growth, but people remain disappointed. Lack of rain or soil moisture hasn't been much of an issue this year. We had lots of rain in late winter and early spring, but it has been slightly drier than normal for the last 3 months. This was not enough of an issue for most people to be concerned with watering the gardens, which is not something that we generally need to worry about here in Ireland, especially with a relatively cool season. There were a few drier periods in May and June, not dry enough to cause problems for established plants. But with our sandy loam soil, which is relatively free draining, soil moisture levels can be more of an issue in the Red Gardens. Last year I had installed dripline watering systems in all of the outside gardens, and I decided to use them quite regularly to water the gardens during the drier periods that we had earlier this summer. I wanted to keep the soil moisture levels in the gardens fairly high at a time when many of the plants were becoming established and starting to grow really quickly. This extra watering could have contributed to the better growth in the gardens that I've seen this year. The plants and all the beneficial biology in the soil more likely had all of the water and soil moisture that was needed, or at the very least were less likely to experience water stress even for short periods. This might have made a significant difference, but it's hard to tell as I didn't leave any of the areas of the gardens unwatered to compare them to, and this is something that I might experiment with in the future. Remembering which of the many different gardens needed to be watered and when was significantly easier this year, as I've switched to a much better system for task management. I've used a bunch of different systems in the past, including notes, calendars, and big spreadsheets, to keep track of all the data, information, and plans. This year, I switched to a simple reminder app for all of it, and that has made a significant difference. Essentially, this app allows me to create a lot of different notes, which can be tagged and organized into different directories and sections. This makes all of the information and plans about all of the crops and all of the different gardens a lot more useful and easier to access and modify. More importantly, I can add reminder dates and times to each of the notes for when I want to sow different crops or do a particular task, and these can be set to repeat at any interval that I want. All of this makes it very easy to create daily or weekly task lists and to identify and help prioritize all those tasks that might have fallen behind on, which is something that often happens in a busy season in the gardens. This change in task and information management systems is probably the most significant and beneficial change that I've made this year, and I do enjoy the incentive of being able to click the box or to update the note in order to clear a task list. And I think this may be one of the reasons why the gardens are growing so well this year, as I've more consistently been able to do the things that need to be done when it's best to do them. I've also been much less likely to forget about things, especially now that I'm managing the gardens by myself. And the persistent reminder makes it harder to ignore the tasks or areas of the gardens that I might want to avoid. Not inputting all of the data directly into a spreadsheet does mean more work later if I want to calculate things such as yield data. But this system prioritizes planning, access to information, and getting things done, not making it easier to number crunch. Weeding the gardens is one of those regular tasks that I think has really benefited from using this reminders app. During the growing season, I generally try to do a full weeding of all the gardens once a week to get to the young weed seedlings when they're easiest to kill and to prevent more established weeds from gaining more ground. I haven't been so consistent with this in the past, often because it's an easy task to overlook, but a weekly reminder to weed each garden has actually really helped this year. I still don't get around to weeding every garden each week, but a persistent reminder generally means that I don't leave it for much longer. So this year there has not been a lot of new weeds in the gardens, with a few notable exceptions, and the more established patches have been weakened. By keeping the weeds at a low level, even if I don't get around to weeding at a busy time of the year when everything is growing so quickly, there's less of a chance of weed pressure building and the crops that I'm growing having to deal with unwanted neighbors. The impact of weed pressure on the crops probably would have been less this year anyways with the extra watering I was doing, as the crops wouldn't have had to compete with other plants for scarce soil moisture. It's also less of an issue if there is abundant fertility in the soil, as the weaker roots of a lot of the crops won't need to compete with the more aggressive weeds if fertility is low. Over the years, I have gradually been building up the soil fertility levels in most of the gardens, and this year I've been focusing even more on making sure there is ample fertility for all of the plants, especially the hungry ones. In some of the gardens, I add a substantial amount of municipal compost every year, but I have found that extra concentrated fertility generally needs to be added for crops to grow well with this less fertile form of compost. This year, I decided to try to amend this compost that I buy in large bags by digging it out of one bag and into another while layering in other forms of concentrated fertility. I added a lot of nitrogen to each bag and a fair amount of phosphorus, which is also apparently quite low in this compost. I also added some seaweed dust to supply some trace elements and gypsum to provide more sulfur and calcium. I added quite a bit of concentrated material to each of the bags and then watered them in with a biologically active compost tea, covered the bags, and let them sit for a while. I wanted to give a chance for these amendments to be incorporated into the compost before I spread it into the gardens. I was essentially trying to turn this lower grade compost that is generally only useful in the gardens as a mulch into a higher grade feeding compost in a fairly short period of time, and it seemed to have worked. This fertility boost seems to have made a significant difference, and I think it is a big part of the reason why the plants in these gardens have done so well this year. It would be very easy for me to jump to the conclusion that the reason that the gardens are doing so well this year is because I amended this compost, with the obvious correlation of doing something significant that I've never done before with getting results that I've never seen before. It's easy to assume causation. And I do think that the decision to heavily amend this compost has contributed a lot to the better results that I'm seeing. But in the gardens where I didn't use this amended compost and relied on other compost sources and forms of fertility, some of the crops are also growing really well. With the complexity of a garden environment, I think it's important to accept that there's always other things going on. Getting reasonable weather conditions for the types of crops that I'm growing, having consistent soil moisture, eliminating all weed pressure, and doing all the other tasks when they need to be done, these are all part of it as well. And there are other factors, including a lot more liquid feeding with comfrey nettle and weed teas, and simplifying crop planting plans to things that I was confident would grow well. I also decided to not grow in a few of the developed spaces this year, to grow easier to manage crops in one of the polytunnels, and I put on hold planned development of new growing spaces. All of this meant that I had more time for the spaces that I am growing in, which is especially important now that I'm working mostly alone. The decision to cut back what I was taking on, at least for this year, seems to have been a very sensible one, and it's great to be able to see what the gardens can produce with sufficient attention. Only taking on what I'm pretty confident I can manage well is probably part of me developing as a better grower. I have been growing vegetables for many years, and I've tried a lot of things and learned from a lot of failures, and taking the time to condense some of it into these videos and receiving a lot of valuable comments, suggestions, and criticisms. With all of this experience and a focus on trying to keep an open mind about things, I shouldn't be surprised that the gardens are growing better this year than they did last year, and I hope that trend continues. Another significant factor is I've been focusing more on the gardens and spending less time focusing on videos. This is all part of figuring out how to manage the gardens without the regular support and help from Chris, and taking the time to transition this project into something that's more realistic and holistic. But I do regret not being able to make nearly as many videos as I would want, and there are so many things that I want to make videos of. As the season shifts into more of a harvesting mode and I have more capacity, I plan to make and upload videos more frequently. If you like these videos and value the work that I'm doing in this Red Gardens project, it would be great if you would consider supporting me through Patreon or PayPal. The links to both are in the description below. This type of support would definitely encourage me to focus more on making videos. But if you don't feel you have the financial capacity for something like that, liking, sharing, and commenting are all great ways to support this channel. But most importantly, thank you for watching.